Hello and welcome once again to this class. We are looking at the history of music. We are continuing our series, and this time we are going to be looking at the composer Johann Sebastian Bach. We are going to look into his works, his contribution during his era to music. And so, in looking at Johann Sebastian Bach, we want to look first at his birth and early life, and we're going to look into his family and education, and we equally look into his popular works and some defining moments of his life. So these are the three areas that we are going to focus on. Johann Sebastian Bach was a German composer famous for his organ music. He lived in the 17th century during the Baroque period. People always admire him and his sons, who eventually became composers too, like himself. He composed so many works. There are many which he did. His early life is such that he was born in 1685 in Germany as the last child of 8 children to a family of musicians. And he developed this passion for music from his father and his siblings, who were equally gifted in music. His major works include the Goldberg Variation, the Bradensburg Concertos, the Well-Tempered Clavier, Cello Suite, and the Mass in B minor. Okay, now we are going to go in details. This time around, we'll have the opportunity of listening to this tutorial from Piano TV that is going to take us through all we need to know about Johann Sebastian Bach.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Piano TV. So I am very excited today because we are going to be talking about the legend, Bach, one of the greatest composers of all time. And it's actually the first time we're going to be talking about a Baroque composer on this channel. We've done other guys, we've done Mozart and Haydn, and classical composers, we've done Beethoven, we've done romantic composers like Chopin. So I thought, now's the time. And if you don't know what Baroque music is, check it out on the screen, that'll help you out, that'll give you a little bit of background information. Anyway, there is a lot to talk about in today's video, so let's just get started. Johann Sebastian Bach was literally born to be a musician, as were his eventual children. He was born into a musical family. The Bach family had already established themselves in Germany as being, reputable musicians. So Bach's father was a musician, as were basically all of his uncles. Bach was born in 1685, and he was the youngest of 8 children. When he was quite young, around 9 or 10, his parents both died, so he was sent to live with his eldest brother, who was also a musician. Little fun fact is that Bach's elder brother, the one he was living with, actually took music lessons under Pachelbel, and Pachelbel was another famous German composer you've probably heard of. He wrote the very famous piece Canon in D. I want to make a note that throughout this video, I'm going to be referring to Bach as sometimes Bach by his last name, or, if we're feeling like want to get more on an intimate level, I might call him JS, Johann Sebastian. Just letting you know now. So it's probable that Bach's older brother passed on some of that Pachelbel knowledge to him as well. At age 15, Bach was enrolled in a music school named St. Michael's, and that's where a lot of really important musical ideas were planted in his brain. He was exposed to a wider range of European music beyond just German music. He was exposed to Italian music and French music, among others, and he also had access to the school's organs and harpsichords. One way that many musicians used to study was by copying out sheet music, basically writing it out by hand. And our JS did this a lot of times. When a musicologist named Stouffer discovered some organ music that a teenage Bach had copied, he had this to say: Bach was a disciplined, methodical, well-trained teenager, deeply committed to learning his craft. If there's any theme running through J.S.'s life, it's industriousness. Of course, he was talented, but he makes a strong case for hard work as well. Of course, like many fresh new graduates, Bach didn't instantly get his dream job. So what he did is he worked for a duke in Weimar, and he probably had to do lots of non-musical, menial, sort of boring tasks there, but that didn't stop him. He managed to make a name for himself so that in 7 months, he was invited to do a keyboard recital at the new church in Arnstadt. So his performance in Arnstadt must have gone well, because after doing that, he was invited to work at the new church, which was good news for Bach because it was good pay. It was relatively easy work. He had a little bit of freedom. And, maybe best of all for him, they had a shiny, new, amazing organ. And Bach's lifelong favorite instrument was the organ. However, J.S. always marched to his own beat, which didn't always make him agreeable with his employers. He periodically left Arnstadt to walk to Lübeck, which was no small feat seeing as Lübeck was about 400 kilometers away in one direction. He made this journey so that he could visit the great organist Dietrich Buxtehude, and apparently paid no mind to the distress of his employer during his several months of absence. So that job ended, and eventually Bach returned to Weimar. His eventual time in Weimar from 1708 to 17 is looked on by music history as the first of his 3 great time periods. Bach was 23, he was freshly married to his second cousin, Maria Barbara, and he had a great job as an organist at a large court. During this time, a bunch of future famous Bachs were also born, such as Wilhelm Friedemann Bach and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. It was during this time that Bach really blossomed as a composer. He was being influenced by all different kinds of European styles, including the Italian harmonies by current composers at the time, such as Vivaldi. And it was in Weimar when Bach first penned the famous Preludes and Fugues, which were later compiled into the Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1 and 2. Which, if you're a keyboard player, you've probably heard of those. In 1714, when J.S. was nearly 30, he was promoted to the director of music, and that gave him a lot of responsibilities, among which was writing and performing a monthly cantata. Now, cantatas were sung in the Lutheran church, and they were giant multi-movement vocal and instrumental compositions, and they were a key component of a Lutheran liturgy. But then Bach's stubborn personality took the lead again. Apparently, he wanted to move on from his job. He didn't want to work there anymore, but he wasn't actually allowed to quit. But that didn't stop him. Basically, he was jailed for a month. He went to prison because he was too stubbornly forcing the issue of his dismissal. So apparently, yeah, Bach couldn't take no for an answer. Through and through, always his own free agent. And I guess after the month of jail time, it worked. And that takes us to the second, or the middle period of Bach's life, the Cothen period, from 1717 to 23. Now, Prince Leopold of Cothen hired J.S. as a musical director, and being a musician himself, he actually appreciated Bach's talents and skills, and because of this, he gave him a lot of freedom. And Leopold also wasn't a religious person, and what that meant for Bach is that he was required to mainly compose non-religious music, such as secular cantatas, orchestral suites, and other dance music, as well as the really famous Brandenburg concertos. There's another really famous German Baroque composer that you've probably heard of, and he was also just as famous as Johann Sebastian Bach at the time, and that's Georg Friedrich Handel. Now, interestingly, they were both born in 1685. They were born in the same year, but for some reason, and we'll never exactly know why, but despite Bach's repeated attempts to meet Handel and talk with him, they never ended up, their paths never managed to cross. In 1720, Maria Barbara, who was Bach's wife, died suddenly, but he wasted no time, and the next year he married again, this time to a much younger woman named Anna Magdalena. You might recognize that name from Bach's notebook for Anna Magdalena. It's a compilation of instructional pieces that are still pretty famous today in the keyboard world. But anyway, Anna Magdalena was a very talented singer, very talented soprano, and she performed and did that kind of thing. And between the two of them, they had 13 children, which is a crazy amount of children. And then if you add that with the amount of children that Bach had with Maria Barbara, his first wife, he fathered 20 children in total. And of those 20 children, half of them survived into adulthood. And that's a lot of children. So, I mean, Bach wasn't just industrious in music. And that brings us to Bach's third and final period, which was the Leipzig period, from 1723 to 1750, which was the year that he died. So RJS got the job of cantor at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, which was his highest ranking, fanciest, busiest job that he had in his life. So interestingly, Bach wasn't the first choice for the job, and that probably has something to do with his very strong and willful personality. I'm sure he had a reputation for that. The first choice for the job was another famous German Baroque composer named Georg Philipp Telemann, who you may have heard of, again, as a keyboard player. But since Telemann declined the job and wanted to work in Hamburg instead, they asked Bach, and the rest is history. And again, like before, Bach was expected to compose weekly cantatas for church service. And during this time period, Bach composed probably over 300 cantatas in total. And if you remember from when we were talking about this earlier in the video, cantatas are huge multi-movement works. They are not like simple 5-minute little ditties. Like a cantata, I would say an average cantata would be like 20 or 30 minutes long. So just think about that for a minute. If you think about the stereotypical pop album is about 40 minutes, that would be like Bach composing 150 modern albums in like just one small chunk of his life. Let that sink in. That blows my mind. So despite all of the other tasks of his job, J.S. did yet more work by becoming the director of the Collegium Musicum, which was a performance group that played secular, not sacred music. Now, these groups generally consisted of the best musicians in town of the day, which was a position that established Bach even more firmly in Leipzig. The Collegium Musicum performed frequently, and that included at Bach's favorite coffee house, which inspired the famous coffee cantata, Café Zimmermann. And many of Bach's secular pieces of this period were performed by this Collegium Musicum, including tons of his violin and keyboard concertos. Bach's ambitions, however, knew no bounds. He was always reaching for more prominence in Leipzig and more, authority and more jobs and things like that. So he wrote the early manuscript for his very famous Mass in B minor, and he showed this manuscript to the elector so he could be appointed for the position of court composer. And he's like, check out my manuscript, I'm pretty awesome, right? And then the elector's like, yeah, you're pretty awesome, hired. This Mass, by the way, Bach never got to hear it performed in his lifetime because he wrote it a little bit too late, but it's widely considered to be one of the greatest choral works of all time, not just the Baroque period. It's some serious stuff. Between 1749 and 1750, Bach's health started to take a turn for the worse. And he was also starting to go blind, so he hired the eye surgeon, John Taylor, to do eye surgery on him. But unfortunately for Bach, John Taylor, total quack, didn't know what he was doing and completely botched the job. Apparently the eye operation was considered very unsuccessful and was probably a contributor to Bach's death. In another weird parallel between Bach and Handel, another thing that links them is John Taylor, because Handel was also going blind, and Handel also had eye surgery by this John Taylor guy, and it was also botched. John Taylor making everyone blind. So Bach officially died in 1750 at the age of 65 from a stroke. And that stroke was thought to have been caused by bad eye surgery. Though Bach was really successful and built from the ground up a really impressive career in music, he was largely forgotten about in the 18th century. And this happens to composers everywhere because the times were changing and Baroque music had become unfashionable in the classical era, so people kind of dropped him by the wayside. But in the Romantic period, in the 1800s, due to the effort of certain composers like Mendelssohn and Chopin, Bach was, and also music publication, like his works were published again, and I'm pretty sure there was like a biography published on him in the early 1800s, and that recirculated him into the, popular consciousness. And ever since the mid-1800s, Bach has again been like firmly established in the classical music world and is considered one of the greatest composers of all time. But I just want to make a note that just because Bach became unfashionable and kind of fell out of public opinion and no one talked about him anymore, that doesn't mean that other musicians forgot about him, because people like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven were really inspired by Bach. So for example, Haydn had copies of the Well-Tempered Clavier and also of his Mass in B minor, and Mozart Mozart transcribed a lot of Bach music, and he also wrote in counterpoint in a direct callback to Bach's writing style. And Beethoven did the same thing. And apparently, Beethoven could play the Well-Tempered Clavier by age 11, like a little genius wonder child. It was not an easy collection to play. Beethoven also described Bach as the father of harmony. Those guys loved him. As for his personality, we really don't know a lot of details about like the real Bach. And there's a few reasons for this. Like part of that is just because he lived so long ago that the extra 100, 200 years between like him and say a guy like Chopin makes a really big difference. I guess that would only be like about 100 years. And Baroque music also wasn't like the pour out your heart variety. It's not like we can get any emotional understanding of Bach through his music, because that just wasn't the purpose of music at the time. But what we do know about Bach is that he was a really hard worker, and you can see that just in his like huge body of works that he left behind, as well as his career ambition. He was also really strong-willed and really proud, which you can see by, you know, his conflicts with employers and his time spent in prison. You can also see that in his dedication to walking hundreds of kilometers to see an organist perform and hang out with him. Bach was extremely self-motivated. He didn't let anything get in the way of furthering his musical education, whether that be the fact that he had a job or that his employers didn't want him to leave for several months at a time, and he didn't let distance get in the way either. All that being said, let's be clear. Bach was not a saint. Despite his many admirable qualities, like any other human being, he had his faults and flaws as well. Apparently, he was known to be pretty temperamental, especially for like mistakes, and you know, he wasn't very tolerant of inadequacy in musicians. And he could be a little bit temperamental too. So I'm going to share some anecdotes with you that can maybe show you another side of Bach. Apparently, the organist of St. Thomas's made a mistake on the organ during rehearsal, and Bach was enraged, so he tore his own wig from his own head. He threw it at the organist and proclaimed, "You ought to have been a cobbler." Bach also got into a dagger fight with a bassoonist when Bach said that the bassoonist's playing sounded like a nanny goat. The bassoonist attacked Bach, and Bach pulled a dagger on him, because, like, I guess he didn't mess around, but luckily, no one was injured in that tussle. Another story about Bach relates to the development of the piano, which was still in its infancy in Bach's time. Bach had a friend named Silbermann who was developing new keyboard instruments, and he designed a couple of early piano prototypes, which he invited Bach to try. Bach, though, he wasn't even a little bit impressed, and he called the treble notes weak, and he said the keys were hard to play. Silbermann was kind of choked about that, but at least he took the criticism to heart and ultimately made better pianos. And that is all for today's episode on a brief history of Johann Sebastian Bach. I hope you enjoyed this little musical tour, and hopefully you learned something, or maybe you were just, I don't know, mildly entertained or anything like that. Thank you so much for watching this video. As always, I do videos on Tuesdays and Saturdays, so stay tuned for those. Thank you to everyone who helps make these videos possible, and I will catch you guys next time. Bach's